Multinational is made up of a corporate headquarters and a series of national subsidiaries which held sway for a long time and still does actually, and much of the academic writing about multinational companies is hopelessly outdated. Very few multinationals are structured like that. We know that the overwhelming majority have a range of divisional or business unit structures. They also have regional structures, so countries clustered into regions. There's a range of different ways of organising which coexist, and any approach to understanding norm-making must take that as one of its points of departure. I think we should see those complex structures as partially nested within one another. That's a term that I've used in relation to other work. So what goes on at one level can shape and condition what goes on in another without determining it. And it also, so that partial nesting must take account of that, and a strong degree of contestation. We must also see norm-making, global norm-making, not as simply the preserve of those very senior actors at corporate headquarters, but as something that a range of actors across a multinational company will look to engage in. So we see global norms as shared ideas, standards of appropriate behaviour that have some degree of governing force, and by governing force I mean it influences behaviour, it shapes what people do in their daily work. And we see this as made up of two forms. So there's a link to the paper which Phil presents later on when we talk about the formal, the informal. Sometimes these are written down, they're explicitly stated, and there's a system of formal rewards and sanctions for compliance with them. In other cases they're more informal. There may be ideas which have become widely discussed and taken for granted, but they may lack the same sort of formality, at least in the regulatory force with which they are enforced, but nevertheless shape behaviour. And we make a distinction between norms and institutions, which is essentially one of levels or of aggregation. So we see norms as specific enough to isolate particular forms of behaviour, single standards of behaviour, but institutions as the clustering together of sets of norms, the way that they structure together and where they're interrelated. So the difference between norms and institutions we see as largely one of aggregation. In this respect, we follow the work of Finnemore and Sekink in international relations, who adopt a similar approach. I suppose an obvious element of that in thinking about the space within which globalizing actors inhabit is that we must see norms as contingent on one another. We must see them as interwoven and therefore interdependent. And we do this through the notion of a web. Did I flip across two slides so far? Yeah, no, okay. So we think about globalizing actors occupying a space which is characterized by a web of norms. So no norm will ever enter a normative vacuum. It always enters a vacuum which will be more or less supportive of the new norm. They'd be dependent on other norms for its longevity. And rather like spiders, globalizing actors have got to be able to work their way around a space that we characterize in this web. It's a web which we must see as contextualize, in the sense that there's both an intra and extra corporate element to the contextualization of norms. So a new norm, an emerging norm within a multinational company must to some degree fit with other norms within that company. It must also fit to some degree within a extra corporate context that be more or less supportive of this web. So we've got to see the web as one which is contextualized. We also want to see the web analogy and critique it a bit though. The notion of a spider's web is of something which is created by one spider, and no web of norms is ever created by one actor. And in this respect we follow Tregaskis' notion of an anthill created by thousands of ants. And you might think of global norm making in a similar way. It can never be created by a single globalizing actor. So there's got to be some sort of role for the personalization of norm making. There's got to be a sense that there are multiple actors dependent on one another playing different roles within this. So we've got to personalize as well as contextualize. And thirdly, with the web analogy and the anthill analogy, need to be adapted a little bit further. I mean, ants, by and large, follow their instincts, incorporating with one another, and humans don't always do that. So we've got to be wary of and prescient of the ways in which interests diverge, the ways in which the multinational can become a terrain in which different interests are advanced and protected. Christensen's notion of a battlefield. So we've got to see this as a process which is contested as well as contextualized and personalized. And then in terms of, I suppose, how the literature scores in terms of those three key elements, we identify three main strands of previous work in this area, which score perhaps well on one of these dimensions and not so well on the other. So one of these is, I suppose, the mainstream of the international management area, where writers like Bartlett and Ghoshal and Gupta and Govindarajan talk about the structures and focus on the structures that link actors from different subsidiaries. Rarely talking about actors, actually, talking about subsidiaries or groups, units within the multinational companies. They're focusing on the sorts of mechanisms that are capable of transferring information from one unit to another. This is a focus on the capacity of subsidiaries. It scores reasonably highly on one aspect of the intra-corporate context, analysing different types of cross-border mechanisms within the multinational company, but says very little about the roles of individual actors and how they diverge and how this process is contested. The second literature is the mainstream of the international HRM field, which focuses on the internationally mobile individual, particularly expatriates, but also other forms now, changing forms of international assignment. And this literature is certainly personalised. It certainly looks at the individual and looks at the individual's role. In more recent aspects of this literature, there's a focus on how actors take on very different international roles, so it's certainly personalised. But it says very little about the context within which they operate. Empirical studies in this area are often of individuals across a range of organisations, maybe surveys of particular associations and members of associations, say nothing about corporate context and almost nothing about the sorts of challenges and disagreements that these actors encounter. So it says nothing about contestation. In the third literature, the use of the neo-institutionalist approach to look at the multinational company has focused on the ways in which multinational companies straddle different institutional environments, sometimes using the notion of institutional duality, that multinationals face pressures, or the subsidiaries within them face pressures to both gain legitimacy within the organisation by adapting to corporate norms, but also gain legitimacy within their own environment by adapting to local norms. And this tension, this duality, is the focus of the work of people like Tatjana Kostova and others. And this has become very popular. I suppose it's looked at one element of contextualization, the way in which multinationals are embedded in multiple institutional environments. So it scores reasonably highly on the extra-corporate norm-making, although it's limited even in that respect. It certainly says very little about contestation, very little about what, as we put it in the paper, is at stake for actors as they engage in global norm-making, and very little about different individual roles, so it doesn't score highly on personalisation or contestation. And so what we try and do, Valeria, how long have I got? Another 5 minutes? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so what we try and do in the paper then is say, well, what should this web look like? How can we conceptualise this web a little bit further than we already have done? And we use the notion of strategic action fields put forward by Fligstein and McAdam to do that. So what does this look like? I suppose the starting point in this approach will be to say, well, actors within a field which we define as the coverage of a norm across borders within a multinational company, share some sort of understanding about the purpose of that field, in our case, the nature of that norm, what it's about, and how the relationships within that field relate to that norm. But they don't. It doesn't assume, as indeed most versions of neo-institutionalism do, that actors share the same interests or view that norm through the same sort of frame of reference. So it's explicit about the way in which fields will be contested. They are sites for conflict. There will be, as Fligstein and McAdam put it, a lot of jockeying for position within fields to shape norms. And they make this distinction, which is a starting point in thinking about the different structural positions that actors take on within fields. Of those within the dominant coalition they refer to as incumbents, and those who are not they refer to as challengers. They also introduce a third group called those in governance units in their work. So contrasting with, certainly with neo-institutional theory, the claims on sort of some sort of notion of ideational consensus around global norm making are much weaker. Fligstein and McAdam's notion of strategic action fields doesn't assume that there is a consensus around the desirability of norms, and that acceptance of them can be reluctant, it can be temporary, it doesn't imply some sort of notion of consensus. So, 5 more particular points. I started by talking about how norms are interdependent on others, how they interrelate to others. They can't operate, by definition, they cannot operate on their own. And the strategic action fields approach has something to say about that. It uses stresses the interdependence of norms, the intersecting nature of fields. They use the notion in their original work of Russian dolls, so one norm field or norm as defined as the coverage of the field it exists within another, and then within another, and then within another. So there are different levels at which norms operate. Now, I think we need to adapt the notion of Russian dolls, which implies a kind of neatness of one being neatly contained within another. There's much more intersecting and messiness in the coverage of norms than that notion implies, but there's certainly an emphasis on interdependencies. That these fields are not set, so the strategic action fields approach emphasises the way in which fields are constantly evolving. The coverage of them, the extent of them are evolving in response to a challenging and changing external environment, but there's also restructuring, constant restructuring, and this resonates very strongly with our experience of observing the multinational company, a constant churn within the structures and boundaries of the multinational firm. So rolling turbulence is strongly emphasised within strategic action fields. As I've indicated already, it has the beginnings of an understanding of how contestation exists within fields. I think we need to go beyond incumbents, challenges and governance units, but it nevertheless draws attention to the structurally different positions within which actors operate within fields. And that can lead to both the obstruction as well as the facilitation of global norm making. And further, the strategic action field approach emphasises the skills that actors need to navigate their way around a complex web of norms. They need to be able to frame a case for change if they're involved in global norm making. They need to be able to read where opposition is likely to emerge. They need to be able to build a network which helps them form a coalition to pursue their particular course of action. These are all understood as elements of social skills. And so in all of those respects, I think the SAF's approach has some promise in highlighting what are crucial aspects of how global norms are created, disseminated, implemented, monitored, amended, contested as time progresses. And I suppose what we've looked to do in this project is incorporate a method that meshes with the conceptual framework, a method that allows actors to speak. It acknowledges the complexities of organisations and the range of ways in which global norm making can emanate from a number of different levels. And to do that, to really understand that, you need an approach which is flexible enough to allow unanticipated stories to emerge, and that means allowing actors at a range of different levels to speak. In other words, we need a strong exploratory element. We need to be able to locate global norm making within the, I suppose, the material realities of the nature of people's work at a range of different levels. And in this project, I suppose that's a sort of founding element of the way in which we've sought to go about uncovering and understanding global norm making.
Thank you very much. Sorry.